Hello and welcome everyone to the Persuasion Lab podcast. I'm your host, Moeed Amin. The goal for this show, as those who are longtime listeners and viewers now, you will know, the goal for the show is to elevate the profession of sales and persuasion. So whether you're a sales professional, sales leader, a company founder, or someone who's not in the sales profession, but persuasion and convincing people to take action is a big part of what you do and your career progression. Well, this is the show for you. And we cover everything from not just the conventional sales skills and behaviors and teachings, but success is more about the person you become, not just about the skills and knowledge you acquire. So we will help you on that journey. And we've had people who are experts in body language, behavioral psychology, personal branding, and even someone who's an expert in health to make sure that you, at every engagement, at every situation, you're the best version of yourself and that you're presenting that best version of yourself. So really, really good to have you join me on the show today. And one of the things I've been thinking about and discussing quite a lot of people recently is, the collaboration between sales and marketing. I believe very strongly that the future of successful businesses will be those that really get the connection between sales and marketing right. Now, we both know because of the buyer's journey and how that is absolutely changing in such a fast way now, and what used to work even a week ago will sometimes change. That connection between sales and marketing will make sure that you're seeing everything that's happening in the buyer's journey, and you are presenting the right position of yourself and your messaging and the attention capture in the right places on that buyer's journey. More importantly, as well as what that will lead to and what we've seen with other businesses, is that your cost of customer acquisition will be dramatically lower than your competitors. But getting it right is not easy. And that's why I've invited our guest today. Now, our guest is someone who has been in the B2B marketing space for over a decade now, and he has worked for and with some very well-known brands like Sodexo, Henkel, Chevron, Caterpillar, Logitech, as well as Samsung. And he's the co-founder of a company called Einblick. And what he essentially does is he helps B2B companies stand out from the crowd and actually become memorable. And in a radically crowded world, the ability to do that is even more important, especially for buyers to kind of instantaneously identify someone and their brand and what they stand for. So the stronger your brand, theoretically, the stronger the brand of the salespeople when they're going in for some of those conversations with buyers. So I'm truly delighted to welcome our next guest on the show today. So please help me welcome Mr. Christian Klepp. Christian, apologies. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Moeed. It's a pleasure to be here. Wow, that was a heck of an intro, so I better live up to the hype.
Well, I'm really confident that you will, certainly from the discussions that you and I have been having. Yeah. I thought, you've got such value to add to our listeners. And I think it's really important because now more than ever, we're starting to see that, salespeople kind of have to have certain appreciation, or even at the minimum appreciation, but even marketing skills in some way. And vice versa, we're seeing that marketing people have to have a much better appreciation of what's going on with sales.
100%.
And they kind of need to think in that way as well. Yeah. So before we go into that, and that's a topic that's really interesting, we're going to cover that today. But before we go into that, one thing that you and I did talk about before was the fact that marketing, especially in B2B business, is often overlooked.
Yes.
Or at least misunderstood. Yes. Let's start with that, because that's really important. Why do you feel that's still the case?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity. And just to set the record straight, I actually did start out my career in sales. I didn't start out in marketing, right? I actually, my first job out of university was working as a sales representative for a furniture import exporter in Germany, right? So
right.
I do understand the sales process and the sales role of a salesperson very well, actually. And also as a business owner, as you can attest to, whether we like it or not, new business and customer acquisition and account servicing, for that matter, does fall into our area of responsibility, right? But onto your question, right? And it's a very valid one. And I think that from my experience and from what I've seen and the conversations I've had with other B2B marketers, there are a couple of factors involved, okay? So one of them being many traditional B2B industries. So I'm just gonna like throw a few out there: steel, construction, shipping, and whatnot. A lot of these have traditionally been very sales and product / solutions driven, right? And it almost feels like that would be obvious and predictable, right? But it's for that reason, because it's been the business model for so many years, right? And it didn't change very much until, well, past couple of years, like 2 or 3 years ago. But prior to that, it was very sales and products and solutions driven, and the sales people and people in this function were given a bit more, I'd like to call it airtime, right? They were given more priority because they were very, in terms of their value that they added to the organization, was very visible because they're bringing in the revenue, right? They're bringing in the revenue, and as a result of that, they had that, I call it the voice at the table, right? Like senior management. Whenever budgets were discussed, investment allocation and so forth, sales and other functions of that nature, product development and so forth, they were given first dibs. Marketing did not have such a role because it wasn't as visible as these functions, right? And to a certain degree, that's changed, thankfully, but not everywhere, right? So you're still getting marketing departments that still need to fight to justify, if I may say so, their existence, right? And that goes on to the next factor, which is there's a general lack of education. There's a general lack of education among senior management and other non-marketing functions about the true value that the marketing function actually brings. And, you know, it's going back to that old adage, right? Out of sight, out of mind. If you do not do the homework as a marketer to help, it's not necessarily to justify your role, but to build that rapport, to establish that relationship within the organization that helps you to increase your visibility, then the other departments are not going to know what you're doing. It sounds so simple, but yet, you know, in theory, but in application, I've seen how challenging that can actually be. You've mentioned some of the companies that I've worked or collaborated with in the past, and I've seen that, you know, in some of those organizations play out, right? The other thing I would say is there was resistance to change and complacency. So just going back to what I was saying previously about the, you know, the sales and product driven aspect. My experience, the larger the organization is, the harder it is for them to make those necessary shifts, right? And it's going back to the whole, like, yeah, but we've been doing it like this for 30 years. We've been doing it like this for 20 years. We've been doing it like this for 10 years. So why should we change it now? Or how often have I heard people at the senior management level saying, well, Christian, we've built up this business over 2 decades without marketing. So why should we invest in marketing right now? And I think that's a fairly legitimate question, right? And the answer to that is because the market has changed. The market dynamics have changed. Your customers have changed. The way they buy has changed. Their buying behavior has changed. And for that reason, it's important to invest in marketing. But again, it's about education, because, you know, you don't know what you don't know sometimes, right? But in a nutshell, I would say those are really the reasons why it's overlooked, because it tends to be viewed as, you know, they always played second fiddle. Marketing was always viewed as a support function and an order taking execution mechanism, right? And for as long as companies view marketing as that role, there will be no change enacted.
You talked about the fact that the buyers have changed, the way they buy has changed, the world has changed. Totally get that. Why is marketing the answer? Because I can see the types of business owners and leaders that you described, where they talk about, you know, we've done this for 2 decades now. Why should we invest in marketing? I can see some of them saying, well, why shouldn't we put that money and that investment in sales, for example, or product development or somewhere else? Why is marketing the answer?
Great question. And the answer to that is because, at least from what I've seen in my experience, the product will not sell itself, right? Unless you've got this like steady pool of clients, right, with repeat business. And that might be the case in some organizations, but look at what happened in the pandemic. Companies that have had clients for years suddenly canceled their contracts. Or if they didn't cancel their contracts, they reduced the spend. They reduced the budgets, right? And I know it really depends on which industry vertical you're referring to, because in B2B, as you probably know, it can get very specialized and it's very niche, where they say, okay, but we only have 2 competitors, right? But let's just use the example of steel or construction. The competition is extreme. It's very intense, right? Or even tech. Let's look at tech. It's an extremely crowded market where a lot of companies are using this Me Too positioning. And if you go down into the nuts and bolts, I mean, just take a look at their websites, right? Everybody is generally saying the same thing, right? I mean, the next tech company that uses word innovative in their in their messaging, I mean, like, seriously, you cannot not be in tech, right? Or you cannot be in tech and not be innovative. Let's put it that way. So what I'm trying to say is that there's so much sameness out there. There's so much Me Too positioning. Competition has become intense because the buying behavior and the buyer's journeys have changed, which may also mean that the selection criteria might be a little bit more stringent now. So it begs the question, okay, under these circumstances, how are you, as the service provider, as the vendor, how are you going to stand out and make this buying committee that we know exists in B2B, right? Because it's usually a buying group. How are you going to make them choose you over the competition? And that at times cannot be achieved by sales alone. That needs to be done through efforts where, especially if the buyer or the potential client doesn't know who you are and doesn't know you exist, how do you begin to build that trust, continue to build that relationship, position yourself as a credible source and industry authority and expert, right? And that will come through efforts that are in large part initiated by marketing. Yeah.
And that makes sense, because you kind of partially answered the question I was going to ask you next, which is, well, maybe sales can do that, but you've given some examples as to why sales can't do that alone. Let's dig into that a little bit, sure. Because I want to help our viewers and listeners understand.
Absolutely.
What does good marketing do that is complementary and in addition to what sales can't do, but it helps elevate them and the work that they do? So absolutely. I guess could we give some examples as to what good marketing looks like? What do they do that, quite frankly, sales can't do, but marketing should be able to do to help them?
Yeah, absolutely. If I may use this like super simple example, but this might be the best way to explain it. In the past, and I know we're going to talk about these misconceptions later on, but let me just throw one out there right now. One of these misconceptions that we had in the past was that salespeople were just going out there and saying, well, you have to buy this vacuum cleaner because it's the best vacuum cleaner and it's state of the art, and it cleans your house like nothing else, and that's the end of it, right? But we know that in B2B, it's not such a straightforward process, is it? Most of the time, and at least the clients that I've dealt with, they're not dealing with one point of contact on the client side. They're dealing with at least 4 to 6 people that are part of a buying committee, as I said before, different functions, right, of the buying committee that have to go through these it's a relatively complex and non-linear, let me say that again, a non-linear buying process, right? Where they are trying to get verification from various sources. A big part of that now is online, right? And what do I mean by that? They need to be sure that you are the right choice for what they require as a service provider. So what does that mean, right? To answer your question, they're trying to search online for any kind of content or material that will reassure them that provider A is the one that they will choose ultimately, right, to use or to work with. And what content are they looking for? They're looking for material that will speak to your credibility and your expertise as a said service provider in the niche. And that requires looking at things as ebooks, white papers, articles, podcast interviews, maybe even webinars to a certain extent. So I'm not saying that salespeople can't write, but they generally are probably would rather spend their time talking to the customers, trying to close those deals. And that's the reason why they need marketing support, right? And also look, and it's also for to provide content that is relevant to the buyer. And we're going to get into that later on about the misconceptions and some of the mistakes, right? Because you do see some marketers making that mistake of, you know, churning out content that is not useful for the target audience, and that the salespeople can't use to sell, right? Because it's not relevant, right? But that's a discussion for later on in the conversation.
So if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is the buying journey is definitely not linear, which we know, and there's a lot of research out there. It's become more complex. There's committees involved, which obviously creates groupthink, where people, you know, search for decisions that are contrary to maybe what the purpose would be. They're kind of looking more for conformity and kind of, and that's the whole groupthink situation, which is a problem. But what you're saying there is, in order to create let's call it a conducive environment for when salespeople enter those meetings, and when buyers search for all that information, and we've seen the research out there about how much they kind of search for themselves before they actually speak to any vendor or any salesperson. You're basically saying that, you know, salespeople can't do that and shouldn't do that. In fact, that should be marketing that creates that. I want to talk about the misconceptions, but before I do that, there is one burning question that I have in mind, which is, I would love to get your thoughts on the emotions involved in the buying journey, because marketing, certainly in B2C, seem to be very adept at understanding and tapping into the emotions that the buyer is facing, more so than, say, the logical. Now, there is a misconception still out there that logical business value is still the most important thing when it comes to B2B research. But actually, that's not true, because we know this from science and we know this from research. Emotions are front and center in the decision-making process. In fact, they're front and center in the 4 areas of the brain that are involved in goal setting and goal achievement. So talk to me about how marketing in B2B leverage emotions and try to understand that. Or maybe you say that they probably don't, and actually that's one of the things that is lacking, that should be addressed. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
No, it's a really great point. It's something I've seen time and time again in my own career, and also interacting with clients. I would say there is emotion in B2B. It's just, it plays out differently, you know, as compared to B2C. So what do I mean by that? I think it's really important for the B2B marketer to get into the, if I may say so, the psyche of the B2B buyer. And I'm gonna say buyers plural, right? Because it's a group of people, right? And what do I mean by that? And because, you know, unlike B2C, I mean, like, you know, you go to the grocery store and you buy a can of soda. It's different when you're trying to sell, like, you know, computer software to the aerospace industry, for example, right? So what am I trying to say here? When you get into the psyche, they need to think about what it is that is keeping these people up at night. Like, what are the challenges that they are facing? What are their pain points? And using that design thinking approach, suppose that were no longer a problem, how would that help you, you know, in your job? And also, it's important to understand what the role of each of these B2B buyers are within the organization and what they are mandated to do. What are their objectives for the year? And how can you, as a service provider with your products and services, how can you help them get closer to their goal? Because at the end of the day, let's face it, human beings tend to be selfish people, right? So that's why you have to answer, marketers need to answer this question when they roll out initiatives with every little piece of content they write or put out there. What's in it for me? Right? What's in it for me for referring to the target audience, of course, right? Because the mistake, and, you know, going back to what you were saying earlier, the mistake that I've seen some marketers make is that they just go on and on and on and on about their company's products and services. They focus on the technology, they focus on the features, and they focus on the different aspects of it, or that it's proprietary, or that they're ISO 9000 certified and all. But the customer doesn't really care about that. The customer cares about, how can you help me solve my problem? And that's where the emotional aspect of it comes in, right? That's where the urgency comes in. Although we know We know that the buying process can take several months. I'm not even talking about weeks. It can take months. It can take a year. There is that aspect of it that's that has urgency, right? And that's something that B2B marketers need to understand. And this is why I highly encourage, and even my teams previously, I highly encourage them to sit in on customer calls, on discovery calls, or do what I used to do, is just go out into the field with the sales and sit in a customer meeting so you can actually hear what the customer is saying, what they are not complaining about, but what they're saying are their challenges, right? And what their questions of the salespeople are, what their objections are. So I think that aspect of it is really important for B2B marketers to grasp.
Why don't they do that? Because my view is that marketing, just like sales, both of them are supposed to be championing the perspective and the desires of the customer in the business. If there is one function, or if there's two functions in this case, in a company, in any company, quite frankly, that is supposed to champion the desires and the perspective of the buyers, it should be the marketing and the salespeople, because they are the ones that are at the sharpest end of where that company meets the buyers and the community. So it still surprises me as to why I've observed personally, and I may be wrong here, a lot of marketing teams and individuals don't take the initiative to join those sales calls and sales meetings. Why do you think that is?
It's not such a straightforward answer, I'm afraid. I think from what I've seen, it really depends on several factors, right? I have the same concern as you, by the way. I'm totally with you. They should be doing that, absolutely, right? But I think a part of it is really because they feel that it's not within their scope of work, which can be traced back to what I was saying at the beginning of the conversation, the way that the organization is structured and the culture. Because perhaps in that organization, marketing is not expected to interface with sales. And I've been in situations, even in larger organizations, where the salespeople don't want marketing to interact with the customers. Confidentiality seems to be the first reason that comes to mind. I think the other one is really just they just don't want the marketers to have a conversation with the customers to find out what can be improved, for example. But the problem is, like, if you can never have that conversation that needs to be had, in my opinion, about what needs to be improved, then nothing will move forward, right? But it goes back to scope of work, it goes back to culture, it goes back to mindset, and it goes back to just this lack of experience of actually interfacing with customers, because I've seen that too. I've seen marketers that don't know how to conduct an interview with customers, and what I mean by that is, like, ask them the right questions that will help to generate those necessary insights to identify opportunities and gaps.
I've seen that too, and actually, and a quick way that I've observed around this, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is if the marketing person doesn't have the confidence or the skill set, well, maybe they can ask the salesperson, here are the types of things we want to find out from the customer.
Absolutely.
How about you ask those questions, because you have the relationship, and that way you almost make the salesperson feel empowered as well, but you are also getting the results that you desire. So rather than the longer term approach of training marketing people to have that kind of customer facing kind of confidence and skill set, they can at least help the salesperson ask those right questions, and they're just observing during the call. Let's describe times when you've seen that partnership and collaboration work out beautifully. And
oh, yeah. Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, absolutely. So it was going back to the conversation that I was telling you about in our previous call, and it was an experience that I had personally when I was working as a product manager for Sodexo in the China market, and I was responsible for a product which they called benefits and incentive solutions. Right. Just to give a bit of background, I was part of a team that was brought on by the general manager as a member of the new marketing team, and we were mandated to help. To summarize, the objective was to turn the ship around, which I suppose in layman's terms means make it profitable. That was quite a feat, because we were brought into a company and a business that had been operating a certain way in that specific market for many years, where there were also colleagues that had been there for quite a long time, and they were very set in their ways and the way that they worked, right? So there were a few barriers there. But so how did we turn what seemed like a massive roadblock into an opportunity? So we did a couple of things. We broke down the silos by using a more collaborative approach with the sales teams. And one thing that we did was we actually did exactly what most people don't expect marketing to do. We actually went out into the field with the salespeople. In fact, I was given the task by the GM to go out and sell, right? And it was just to prove a point to the salespeople, right? Because at that stage, when we had entered, the sales were not performing very well, and a part of that reason was because they were using the same approach for the same target segments over and over and over, right? And there wasn't any particular customer segmentation that was done. It seems like they were just approaching customers or prospects randomly, right? So that was one big part of the problem. So what we did was we went out, we started, and it was a bit of a journey, because we spent several months just going out into the field and observing. We went out into the field and had the conversations with the customers. We recorded the sales meetings. We listened to what the customers were saying, the questions that they were asking, and we also we didn't just listen to what the customers were asking. We were listening to how the sales were answering the questions. And then came the objections, and we noticed a pattern in terms of the objections. So one of them obviously was pricing, and then we listened to how the salesman addressed the objections, right? And this wasn't necessarily to assign blame. We were trying to identify, by doing this, we were trying to identify gaps and patterns. Where were we not getting any sales, and why? And after a certain period of time, okay, this industry segment, we didn't have any sales in the past 6 months. Cut. The clients tended to ask these generally same 5 or 6 standard questions, and the salespeople all had different answers to them. We came up with a document. Headquarters like to call it barriers to entry, but I feel that that's a little bit negative, because they said it's an argumentation sheet, and I don't want to say it's an argumentation. It's how do you address these questions? So it's a Q&A sheet essentially, right? So we came up with a standard Q&A sheet. We came up with a standard how do you address objections sheet, right? So for example, the pricing objection, right? Like, oh, your product is too expensive. What are the 5 or 6 things that you could say that would get the client or the prospect closer to a yes instead of like, no, go away, right? We also noticed that a lot of the salespeople went into these meetings unprepared, which means they didn't really know anything about the company. They didn't know who they were talking to. They didn't have it set up. So what we came up with was a checklist essentially, right? So your to-do list before the meeting, your to-do list during the meeting, and your to-do list after the meeting, right? So the follow-up, because previously the follow-up is they'd send a PPT, right? And that was the follow-up, right? But some of these, I mean, like, we're talking about some pretty big contracts here, right? So, there's gotta be a bit of a nurturing sequence there too, right? So we worked together with them to identify what that nurturing sequence could be. Another thing that we did was also, we were always collaborating with the sales team whenever we came up with a campaign, whenever we came up with sales materials. We weren't like going back into our studio and then just churning something out. We would get them involved. The heads of sales, the mid-level managers, the supervisors, right? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are going to be using this. When we came up with campaigns, we got their input. We did the brainstorming sessions together, because what they needed to do after that, we implemented the campaign, but they had to go and warm up the market. It helped to get them involved early on in the piece, rather than like a week before the campaign launch, we brief everybody and then the objections start flying around the meeting room. By using that approach, we noticed a significant change, not just in the attitude towards marketing, but actually when they went for client meetings, they'd ask us to come along. Another thing that we did, and this required quite a bit of work, because we changed the way that they approach client meetings by showing them the data, like the historical data, and telling them, okay, so this is what happened in the past. This is where we need to get to, and this is how we think you can do it. Let's have a discussion. What are your thoughts, right? So once we rolled out the campaign, we would have weekly meetings to monitor the progress. And every time they had meetings with their teams to go out into the field, the marketing team would sit in on those meetings, right? And they would ask for our opinions. That way, there was no longer, thankfully, this clear divide between, okay, well, this is our job, so you guys stay out of it, right? So we got rid of all of that and used this collaborative approach instead. And they understood that we were there to help them and there to support them. The long story short of that was that, besides it being a great collaboration between marketing and the sales teams, but after about a year of working that way, they actually, with one campaign, one sales guy brought in a multi-million-dollar contract, and with that contract, they managed to not just hit their sales quota, but they exceeded the sales quota for the first time in a long time, right? And a big part of that was also largely due to their own efforts, but I would like to say that a portion of that was also attributed to the collaborative effort that we had with them.
That was hugely interesting what you described there.
Mm.
I would imagine that. Well, what resistance did you get at the beginning? Because I would imagine it wasn't smooth sailing from the start, and it was a journey, as you stated earlier.
Absolutely.
What resistance did you get from sales, or maybe even from marketing themselves as well? And how did you overcome them?
The resistance that we got from sales at the beginning, especially from the more senior people, was that they saw us, back to what I was saying in the beginning, they saw us as a support mechanism, right? You are here to print out my brochures and to make my PPT presentation look pretty, and I don't need your opinion about anything else. So it was a little bit of a banging heads, because we were trying to show that their current approach wasn't working, but we didn't want to show it just to make them look bad. We wanted to show them, to help them find a different approach. So it got to the point where all their efforts, they still weren't able to hit their goals. And when we offered a different approach, they slowly started to listen. Now, our new approach didn't equate to success overnight. I mean, as I told you, it took several months. It took a year. And it took a year of them understanding that we are here to help them and not fight against them. But in the beginning, it was, they were, for lack of a better description, they were a little bit territorial. They were like, stay away from my guys, stay away from my team. And, I only need this, and that's it, right? And even in the beginning, when we were talking to the sales directors, right, about okay, well, what are some of the issues that you're facing right now? What are some of the challenges, and how can we help you? And they already had a list. Yeah, when we started out, they had a list of what they called the 11 barriers. The 11 barriers, and what we as the marketing team took away from those 11 barriers were 11 excuses why they couldn't sell the product. They were in a way impediments, but they weren't it wasn't absolutely impossible. It's just that these were the 11 reasons that they had used to condition their team not to approach certain segments. And it took a little bit of, I would say, reprogramming and training to get them to realize that, yes, you had these 11 barriers in the past, but if you switch your approach and you go after different verticals, maybe you can slowly start eliminating these barriers from the list.
How did you convince them, Christian? Because that's the part that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Because if they were resistant to that, you kind of, and they obviously got resistance based upon territories and ego. Now you're almost telling them, hang on, you're going after the wrong verticals now. You need to go after this one. I can imagine how that conversation will go. So how did you kind of slowly turn them around?
It wasn't an easy journey, right? Let me tell you, and I think it's going back to the little anecdote I had earlier on in the conversation, where the GM actually gave me this task of going out to sell just to prove a point. The point was, okay, so I'll give you an example, which is a little bit more specific. Interestingly enough, one of the verticals that they were not going after are the multinationals that were already Sodexo clients. Because for those of you out there who are not familiar with Sodexo's business, they actually have a few businesses, right? So there's the food and catering service, but that's specifically for facilities and factories and schools and whatnot, right? To a lesser degree in North America, but in Europe, especially in France and whatnot, all the schools are, that's also that Sodexo catering. Then there's the remote sites. So they have all those services for like mining sites and whatnot. And then there's a third part, which they call the employee benefit solutions. And that was our category. It comes in different forms across different markets. So in some it's vouchers and some it's cards. But we went after the multinationals that were already using the canteen and catering services, for example. So I went with the GM. So he kind of he arranged the meeting, but then he basically said, okay, off you go, right? So I went in there to sell the solution to them, and it went back and forth. But I managed to close a $40,000 contract. And unfortunately, it was a little bit of a, I don't want to say political, but he basically used that to make a point, right? So once I closed that deal, he took that contract and went to the sales team and said, you see, the marketing guy closed a $40,000 contract. So what are you guys doing, right? And it was this vertical that we told you guys to go after, and you said you can't because of whatever reason. So he did it. So now you're out of excuses, right? So off you go. There was a little bit of restructuring within the sales team that had to be done after that. And there was one division that was responsible for new business, and one of their mandates was really to like target multinationals. And the other ones, there was another division that was specifically like, assigned to go after Chinese state-owned companies, which in the end tended to be our biggest customer simply because of the way that they operate, right? This was a great solution for them because the state-owned companies generally don't give out very high salaries, but they're full of incentives, right? Full of incentives and benefits and insurance and all of those things, right? So that solution that we provided was great for them, for example. Yeah, I hope I answered your question there, but that's one thing that we did to help bridge that gap.
That's interesting that you mentioned that. There's a ton of stuff that I've taken away from this in terms of how marketing and sales can really work together. In fact, it's really about helping each other see how they can benefit each other, right? I mean, I can't think of another way of describing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There are some things that marketing can do that sales don't have the time or the knowledge or the expertise to do, and vice versa. There's access to the buyers and insights from the salespeople that marketing won't be able to get all the time. So that, and together they should be a much more powerful force. So that's interesting. One thing we didn't talk about, and I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but one thing we didn't talk about was the KPIs and the metrics. Yeah. Now, I feel very strongly about how bad MQLs are, right? I think they should be an indicator, but I absolutely don't think that they should be a target KPI that translates into quality of work. What are your thoughts around the KPIs that marketing should have? And more importantly, the shared KPIs that marketing would have with sales?
It's a great question, and it's one of these, like, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a controversial topic, but it's hotly debated, right, on platforms like LinkedIn, for example. I'm with you with regards to the MQLs. I actually would put more precedence on SQLs. And why do I say that? Because, like, look, at the end of the day, we all know this, all right? We've seen this. If somebody downloads an ebook that does not equate he or she is interested to buy, that just simply means they downloaded something, right? It's going to be a long time before they actually do have intent to buy. And we all know that in most cases in B2B, 98% of people that are online looking at your stuff are not ready to buy at this point in time. So what is really important for marketers to understand is that and sales for that matter, is there is a bit of a nurturing sequence involved there. And that's where both sides can help each other, right? Marketing with putting out the right content, putting out the right campaigns and using that right approach, monitoring the activity that's online, and sales with collaborating with marketing to identify which ones are the right leads, which ones should they focus on, and which ones should they focus on nurturing together. So, in answer to your question, I certainly think that there should be more of a precedence for SQLs. Now, how to share the KPI and how marketing should be measured on its success, I would say that probably doesn't make sense to give them exactly the same KPIs as sales, and for the simple reason that marketing does function differently, right, as a discipline, right? So it's not always about well, how many deals did you manage to close as a result of launching that podcast? I mean, that's going to be quite a jump, right? But what we can say, or what I at least could say from my experience, is you can measure marketing in terms of like the number of qualified leads that they help to generate for sales and the number of relationships they help to build. Because I think this is one thing that where marketing can truly shine and add value to an organization is scaling that relationship building function of it. Because as we know, in many scenarios in B2B, people will, and you've heard this 100 times over, people will buy from people that they know, like, and trust. And that component in that whole process is something where marketing can truly, like, make a significant contribution.
That's really interesting. Actually, one of the things you said in there that was so interesting was that identifying where someone is on that buying journey. And I think you said 98% of those that download content and view content, they're not ready to buy. Actually, they're just educating themselves. They're kind of interested in the information. And what I drew from that is just because someone downloaded doesn't mean you throw those contact details over to sales, who then just try to hound them. Actually, you kind of need to take a step back and identify and say, and talk to salespeople together and say, well, could we understand anything about this person on the buying journey? Yes. If they are in nurture stage, how can we both nurture them in the right way that actually endears them to us and probably goes through the discovery phase a lot faster to then into active purchase mode. So I thought that was very interesting. And there's a whole heap of questions I would love to ask around that. Maybe that should be something we do on another discussion for sure. Absolutely. This has been very, very interesting, Christian. I have a question that I ask to all my guests that join us is, which 3 books or experts would you recommend that our followers and our listeners and viewers either buy or follow?
I've got 4 here, but 3. So one is a book that I've read twice now. It's called Creative Confidence, right? And it's written by Tom and David Kelly, right? So they're the founders of IDEO. And that tends to be more, I know it tends to be more relevant probably to the marketing function, but look, at the end of the day, creativity manifests itself across different disciplines, right? You still need to be creative when you're in sales, right? If these past 2 years have taught us anything, is that we need to be creative and innovative, right? Like, some of these clients that I've worked with in these traditional B2B industries, if they could no longer go to trade shows or visit the clients at the shipyard and still have to make sales, well, how are they going to reach out to these people digitally, right? Yeah. I would argue that still requires creativity, right? So that's book number 1. Book number 2 is, it's a book called Why We Buy by Paco Underhill. You've probably read that one. And I know I know that it's very retail heavy. There's a lot about, like,
that's an old book, right? In the 90s. I've got a copy of that. Yeah. It's a great book.
Like the shopping mall experience and what have you. There's a third book, which I've just recently finished reading, called How to Get a Meeting with Anyone, right? And that's by a guy who's become a good friend of mine called Stu Heinecke. As the title of the book suggests, I mean, this is so relevant for salespeople because it teaches you how you can get in the door with your, with these prospective clients in a way that is creative, in a way that makes you stand out, in a way that's not intrusive and aggressive and salesy, right? So, I mean, and I'm not getting any commission, of promoting the book, but if you're so inclined, do get yourself a copy of the book. It's a fun read. It's a fun read, but it's also very practical because he provides heaps of actionable tips. Fourth one is by a Canadian called Ron Tite, and it's called Think, Do, Say. And I had the pleasure of seeing Ron Tite, present at it was a marketing event in 2019 here in downtown Toronto, and there were 500 people in the room, and when he was up on stage, I mean, he had everybody glued, and they were roaring, and it was just like because he's an absolutely funny guy, and that humor, that personality of his comes across in this book. And the book, as the name suggests, is really about how to seize attention and build trust in a busy world, which I think could be highly relevant to both marketing and salespeople.
Yeah, well, look, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I've learned quite a lot, and I'm sure our viewers and listeners have too. How can our viewers and listeners find you, learn more about you, connect with you?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun. And yeah, you can reach out to me. I think the best place is LinkedIn. So my handle is Christian Klepp Einblick Consulting. So Klepp is Klepp, and then Einblick is EINBLICK, and then consulting. You can check out our website at www.einblick.co and tune into our podcast, B2B Marketers on a Mission, if you can, wherever you get your podcasts.
We'll leave those 3 links in the show notes so that people can easily access them. But Christian, thank you very much for joining us and for freely sharing, your views, your analysis, and your expertise, and really helping our viewers understand both the sales and marketing side and how those two can connect together. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Great. And so this is Moeed Amin signing out. And as I say all the time, I believe that company founders, sales leaders, sales professionals, you all deserve revenue growth certainty. And one of the best ways to do that is through science-backed research and analysis to actually peel away and uncover some of the common misconceptions out there around sales and realize how much it's harming your sales approach and what are the right approaches to take. And there's no better way to do that than to understand the buyers and how and why they make the decisions they do and work backwards from that. So if you're interested in such a science-backed approach and really kind of delivering revenue growth certainty, do make sure to contact me, link down below, enquiries@proverbialdoor.com. But until the next episode, thank you everyone for joining us in the journey. Don't forget to like, share, and certainly subscribe, and especially share this with anyone that you feel would really get value from the content that we're sharing here. So until then, thank you very much.